All right, so the last shape we're going to talk about here in our quadrilaterals unit is the kite. Now the kite is a special kind of shape because it's a little different from the other quadrilaterals that we've talked about. A lot of the other shapes that we talked about had opposite sides being congruent. Well, with a kite, the congruent sides are actually adjacent. They're attached to each other. So if we look at this first example, DC and CB are congruent. They're attached to each other, and they definitely look more similarly lengthwise than DA and say DC. So the other set of sides, DA and BA, are congruent to each other. All right, so again, adjacent means they're attached at one point. So DC and BC are attached to each other at point C. That means they're adjacent. And DA and BA are attached to each other at point A, and that means they're adjacent. All right, so again, we have two pairs of adjacent congruent sides. So DC and CB are congruent. So if we know the value of CB, we know that the value of DC is the same thing because they are equal to each other. So DC is 4 centimeters as well. And in the same fashion, if we know that DA is 7 centimeters, we know that BA is also going to be 7 centimeters. So that's the first property of our kites. The second property that we're going to talk about is that only one pair of opposite angles are congruent. So those are going to be the angles where the two different valued sides meet. All right, so here and here, for example. In the first kite that we talked about, those congruent angles would be D and B. Now again, they're opposite, meaning they're across from each other. And if you see that the other angles that are already in there are not congruent, then that means the other pair that's left have to be congruent. Now we also know that there are 360 degrees in any quadrilateral. So if we have the other two angles, we can then figure out what those two congruent angles are. So if I have 360 minus 128 minus 72, that's going to give me how many degrees I have left. So if I do the subtraction, I get 160 degrees remaining. Now, that means that between angle F and angle H, we have 160 degrees. So I'm going to then divide this by 2 to get 80 for each of these angles. All right, so again, they're congruent. We have only one pair of opposite congruent angles. And then the last property that we're going to just touch upon a little bit is that the diagonals are perpendicular in a kite. So what that means is when we draw the diagonals in, they form a right angle where they intersect or where they cross. All right, so let's look here at these next two examples. So with this first one, we're going to be solving for angle B and angle D. All right, now remember, there's always only one pair of opposite congruent angles in a kite. Now, if I see that I have a 70 degree and a 36 degree angle already in there, well, those aren't congruent. So I know that's not my opposite pair of congruent angles. So these ones have to be congruent to each other. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 360, because we know there's always 360 degrees in a quadrilateral, and I'm going to subtract that 70, and I'm going to subtract the 36 and see what I end up with. And that leaves me with 254 degrees to split evenly between angles B and D. Because they're congruent, they have to be the same. So I'm going to divide that by 2. And I'm going to get that each angle is 127 degrees. So angle B has a measure of 127 and angle D has a measure of 127. All right, so again, we figure out how many degrees we already have. We subtract it from 360 and then divide that answer by 2 to get our 2 congruent angles. And remember, those congruent angles are going to be opposite from each other. All right, and lastly, we're going to talk about finding the value of x in this kite. Now remember, we have 2 pairs of congruent adjacent sides. So that means we have 2 sides that are congruent, but they have to be attached to each other. So we have 2 pairs of those. So I see that these sides have to be congruent and these sides have to be congruent. Now I don't really need to do anything with that part of the kite because we don't have any values for it. But here we have these values. We have that one side of this kite is 21, and that's congruent to the side that's 3 minus x. Now the IN here just stands for inches. You don't need to worry about that when you're doing your math, right? It's just a unit label. All right, so remember, when we're setting up something, when they're congruent to each other, we have something equals something. All right, so one side equals the other side. All right, so let's plug in 21 equals 3 minus x. All right, so I'm going to try to get my x by itself. So I'm going to start by subtracting 3 from both sides. So I'm left with 18 equals negative x. So don't forget about this negative that's out front of the x there. All right, and then after that, I'm going to divide both sides by negative 1. Because remember, there's really an invisible 1 there. So I'll be left with x equals negative 18. All right, and that's our value of x. So again, when we have congruent sides that we're talking about, we're going to just set them equal to each other and solve. When we have opposite angles that are congruent, we have to take 360, subtract the other angles, and then divide by 2. All right, and here are the steps again. So take 360 minus the other angles, then take that answer and divide it by 2.